Shalom. It's good to be back for this fourth session out of 5 sessions. Our first session dealt with personal experiences of mine and the reasons for my healing from hatred and being turned into a person of love. And that I love all people. I love Germans, I love Russians, I love Catholics, I love everyone. And I love the Muslims too. I don't hate the Muslims. My second teaching dealt with the 5 deceptions of Islam. And I spoke about that Islam is not a religion of love, it is not a religion of peace, that Allah is not God but Satan, and that Jesus Christ of Islam is coming back a second time as a Muslim to murder all the Jews and Christians. And 5th, that the Quran is a forgery and a fabrication. In our third session, I spoke about the fruits of Islam, about terrorism. And in this session, I will talk about an entirely new subject, which is the one world government married to Islam, or as some Christians call it in the book of Revelation, the harlot riding the dragon being Islam, and the harlot being that one world government, the oil companies, the corporations, and banks that are paid for their services, and they will sacrifice Jews and Christians. In our 5th and final session, God willing, we will deal with Israel and unfortunately, what I feel is the war that is coming soon, probably in sync with a terrorist attack, massive 9/11 type terrorist attack on American soil. And finally, the summary, the latter days, leading to the coming or the return of the Messiah. Coming for the Jews, return for the Christians. But it will be a Jew who speaks Hebrew. And it will usher in the millennium for all those who believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So I want to begin this 4th session with a testimony that appears in each of my 3 books. This is a testimony which changed my life. It is a testimony which helped me to understand why the Christians are not Israel's best friends. The Christians are Israel's only friends. And that Jewish people in America also need to understand that the Christians are not the enemy. It may have been during 2,000 years of history of the Catholic Church that there were problems. It may be that with the Russian Orthodox Church there were problems for 1,000 years. But the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Reformation has been a blessing to the Jews for the last 500 years. The Catholics today have had their own internal Reformation and are following the lead in many ways of the Protestants. And I pray to God that the Eastern Orthodox churches will also stop to teach that the Jews killed Christ. The Protestants dropped that a long time ago. The Catholics just recently dropped it. And I hope, praise God, that the Eastern Orthodox churches will understand that the Jews love Jesus, the people love Jesus, and that those people who were responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus some of them were Jewish people indeed, but that they were married to the one world government of that time, the Pax Romana. 5,000 people followed Jesus to the Sermon on the Mount. People followed him in the streets to be healed. So I think it's fair to say that Jesus, from a Jewish perspective, was a loved rabbi, he was a loved judge, he was a loved faith healer. And had he been hated by the Jewish people, he would have been rendered irrelevant, and therefore he would never have been crucified. He was crucified because he was seen as a threat to the Roman Empire. He was seen as a threat to the establishment in Israel at that time that was very close to the Roman Empire. So I want to talk about today's one world government. In those days, it was Rome. Today, it is the banking, corporation, and oil company syndrome, which is solidly aligned with the Islamic agenda. I started my work in the Christian churches, radio, TV, in 1990. This was just before Desert Storm. I had just left the Prime Minister's office in Israel under Yitzhak Shamir in October of 1990. I came to the States in November of 1990. And without going into personal details, I had a number of family businesses to deal with here. My mother's unveiling. And I had been writing to this dear Christian woman in Texas by the name of Nancy. And for 5 years, we'd been corresponding. And I had never been in Texas all my life. And Nancy said to me, y'all come down to Texas, and I will get you into churches and synagogues, radio and TV. And Nancy in San Antonio did all these things for me. And I was an Israeli army spokesman at the time, a lieutenant, a lowly lieutenant, and I had just finished 2 years of being senior editor and translator in the Prime Minister's office. And I wasn't known in churches, I wasn't known in synagogues, I wasn't known on radio and TV at that time. And it was really rather a miracle that Nancy opened the doors as she did for me in San Antonio and in Dallas at that time. And I spoke a number of times about what was happening in the Middle East. As you may remember, the United States was preparing for Desert Storm. November, December of 1990 was still Desert Shield. It was the buildup for the war, the Desert Storm War. And many people in Texas were asking me at that time what I thought was going to happen. And without revealing too many military secrets, because as an Israeli army spokesman, I was privy to a lot of these secrets, I shared with the American people things that they would not hear on the radio or see on TV. Americans really had no idea of what was about to happen in the Middle East. And I made certain predictions, not because I'm a prophet, because I'm not a prophet. I made certain predictions because I was privy to information from the Israeli sources and from the Israeli media. And the war came. I went back to Israel, January, February, March of 1991, Desert Storm. And by the way, you know, for those people who are always wondering as to whether there is a God, I think that the war, Desert Storm, and the miracles that we saw in Israel after 39 Scuds came and hit us, this was indeed a proof of God's existence. 39 Scuds hit Israel. Only one person died from a direct hit. Now, if you remember, one Scud hit the U.S. barracks in Saudi Arabia, in Dhahran, killing 27 servicemen and women from Pennsylvania. So one Scud killed 27 U.S. servicemen and women, and we mourn for them. 39 Scuds hit Israel, and only one person died. And that person did not have to die. His wife begged him to come into the air raid shelter. And he said, oh, it'll never happen to me. So never test God, never tempt God. God is there to protect us, but we should listen to what God is saying. In this case, this man should have listened to his wife. So we had a miracle from God. How can it be that 39 Scuds hit such a compact city like Tel Aviv, so much population, and only one person died? April 1991, right after Desert Storm, I come back to the States. And Nancy is setting up more churches and more groups in the San Antonio area. And in November of 1990, I had the privilege for the first time in my life to be on Marlon Maddox radio. Marlon Maddox, rest in peace, is no longer with us. He's with the Lord now. And I had some very good experiences with Christian radio and TV in 1990. When I was in the synagogue in San Antonio in November of 1990, there had been a bar mitzvah there, bar mitzvah being the celebration of a young man coming of age at age 13. And a Jewish PR woman came down from Dallas to San Antonio for the bar mitzvah. And the rabbi, the conservative rabbi, asked me to speak. And I got up and I spoke about the situation in the Middle East. And this Jewish woman, who was a PR woman, was very impressed. And she said to me, you know, I work very closely with an organization in Dallas called the Dallas Council on World Affairs. And to tell you the truth, I didn't have a clue what was the Dallas Council on World Affairs. But my Christian friend said to me, you better be careful. The Dallas Council on World Affairs is part of the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations, these people ain't Christians. And you have to be very careful because these people are very ruthless. They are money people, they are oil people, and they are power people. And if anyone gets in their way, they will be killed. That's what I was told by the Christians. And I said to the Christians, oh, come on, you guys. You Christians, you're all so paranoid. But you know what they say? You may be paranoid, but that does not mean that they are not out to get you. Anyway, I come back to the States in April of '91, and I'm in touch with this Jewish woman. as to what is happening with the Dallas Council on World Affairs. She explained to me that this is a very powerful organization and that basically whatever the Council on Foreign Relations says, that's what the President of the United States does. I was very new to all of this, and I didn't understand the different power structures in the United States of America, economic forums. And I was in New York at the time, and all of a sudden I get an urgent telephone call from this Jewish PR woman, and she says to me, get on the next plane to Dallas, get down here right now. You're speaking tomorrow night in Dallas. And I don't have to tell you, you can fly from New York to Dallas for $200 if you get the ticket a month in advance. But if you're going there the next day, it's closer to $1,000. And so I got the $1,000 ticket, and I got down to Dallas, and I was put up in the Stauffer Hotel in Dallas. And I got up to the group there, and I met with General Latham, who was at that time the leader of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Dallas Council on World Affairs. And you know, God has such a sense of humor, because I didn't really understand this at first, but later it became very evident to me that at that time, the Council on Foreign Relations in Dallas had invited Boris Yeltsin. If you remember Boris Yeltsin, he was the mayor of Moscow, and he became the prime minister, the president of Russia, Soviet Union, after the Soviet Union became non-communist. And he had been invited to Dallas to speak 4 times. In other words, a series of 4 lectures. And he was to be paid $50,000 for the 4 lectures. And Boris Yeltsin gave 2 lectures. And the 3rd and 4th lecture, he didn't show because he was too drunk. And basically, they had to put him into the plane on a stretcher. And you know, these organizations pay a lot of money for the very, very ritziest hotels. And all of a sudden, they didn't have a speaker. So I was flown down the next day. And I didn't get $50,000, and I didn't get $1,000, and I didn't even get $1. And at that time, I didn't have any books or any videos. I was just a visiting army spokesman from Israel. So I was there to replace Boris Yeltsin. God has a sense of humor. And then General Latham says to me, so tell me, what is it like to be a general in the Israeli army? And I said to him, General? I'm not a general. I'm just a lieutenant in the Israeli army spokesman's office, in the reserves. See, he thought I was Amnon Lipkin. And I told him, no, I am Avi Lipkin. Amnon Lipkin, Shachak, was a minister in the Israeli government. He was a general in the army. He was chief of staff of the Israeli army. So he thought he was getting the chief of staff. And so God has a sense of humor. So it turns out Lieutenant Avi Lipkin of the Army Spokesman's Office came down to Dallas to speak to a group of 200 of the most powerful people in the United States of America. Oil companies, corporations, banks, ranchers. And there were a lot of Muslims, a lot of very rich Arab, powerful people in Dallas who came. And there was like a quip that this group is really called the Bush-Baker-Bandar Group. President Bush, the father, James Baker III, and Bandar bin Sultan, the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C. And I was told, really, these are the people who really have the power, who really control the United States of America. And I said to them, listen, I'm not General Amnon Lipkin, and I'm going to get up and speak. By the way, I have a little story for you. Nancy was always saying to me in San Antonio, she was saying, Avi Lipkin, that's not a Texas name. You need a Texas name. Texans have a problem with strange foreign names. So, you know, instead of Avi Lipkin, we will call you A.B. Lincoln. So since then, Nancy always says to me, y'all listen to me, A.B. Lincoln. So now I'm, you know, A.B. Lincoln. But at that meeting, I was Avi Lipkin, and I got up to speak, and I did what I considered an excellent Israeli army spokesman presentation. And I said the following. I said to them, you know, in Israel, the Israeli army is supposed to be above politics. And I'm not here to talk as an Israeli politician, which I'm not. And I'm here to talk, let's talk as Israeli military people. And I'm going to give you a presentation which will explain Israel's military position. And that's one of the key elements of this message that I'm doing in these 2 hours. Israel is a small country in the Middle East. When you look at the globe or you look at an atlas, the name Israel has to appear over the Mediterranean Sea because Israel is so small that there's no room to write the name Israel on Israel itself. Israel is from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, to the Jordanian border. It's about 60 miles. You can really drive it in an hour. And from Eilat, the southernmost point of Israel, to the northernmost point on Mount Hermon, you can do that in 6 hours. And you can think how many dozens of times Israel could fit into the state of Texas. And I explained to them that Israel was attacked many times. Israel was attacked in 48. Israel was attacked in 56. Israel was attacked in 67. Israel was attacked in 73. And Israel, as a result of its defensive fighting, had no choice but to expand. And so Israel reached bigger borders. By the way, in American history books, this is called manifest destiny. In other words, America started out with a few little colonies, and when the Native Americans would attack these white settlers, the white settlers would butcher the Native Americans and would expand. And then the next Indian tribes would attack that expansion, and they'd get wiped out or assimilated into the white man's culture. And so forth and so on until the white man went from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Now, Israel, firstly, was promised the land of Israel and the kingdom of Jordan as we know it today, which at that time was part of the Palestine Mandate of the British. In 1917, the British came out with the Balfour Declaration, and they promised a homeland to the Jews in Palestine. Now, you can be politically correct and say, well, that doesn't mean the whole Palestine Mandate, but if you're a maximalist, it does. And the Palestine Mandate in 1917 meant from the Mediterranean to the Iraqi border. In 1922, the British, in order to solve a family dispute in Saudi Arabia, decided that the Hashemites and the Saud family, which could not get along together, the Hashemites should be given the kingdom of Jordan. So they broke off all the land to the east of the Jordan River and gave this to the Hashemite family and to Abdullah. Abdullah became the king of Jordan. And by the way, Iraq at the time was also taken away from the Turks, and they installed a king, a Hashemite king. And it's very interesting that in 1958, Faisal, the king of Iraq at that time, a Hashemite king, was deposed by the Ba'ath Party. And what they did to the 4 American soldiers in Fallujah by dragging around their bodies in Fallujah, what they did to Nick Berg, rest in peace, what they did to Daniel Pearl, rest in peace, is what they did to this king, Faisal. They killed him, they mutilated his body, and they dragged him around the streets of Baghdad. This is behavior, cultural behavior in the Middle East. So Israel went from being Israel on both sides of the Jordan, from the Mediterranean Sea to the Iraqi border, to being only from all the land from the Mediterranean to the Jordan. So the British cut off 2/3 of the Palestine Mandate, gave it to Abdullah. In 1936, the Peel Commission came to Israel and granted what was at that time a very, very small Jewish community in Palestine, in the British Mandate of Palestine. The Peel Commission said the Jews deserve to have a state basically on the territory from Tel Aviv, as we know it today, to Haifa, just a little strip of coastal land. And the Arabs said no, no Jewish state, period. In 1947, and this is after the Holocaust in which 6 million Jews died, the United Nations said to Israel and to the Palestinians, we will grant you a Palestinian state and we will grant you an Israeli Jewish state. This was called the UN Partition of 1947. The Arabs rejected it totally, and the Jews accepted it, even though it meant that out of the 1/3 of the original territory promised to the Jews would get 1/3 of the 1/3. So the Jewish people basically got 1/9 of what the British originally promised them. But the Jewish people took it because it was the first time in 2,000 years that the Jewish people would be resurrected as a state. And don't forget that we had lost 6 million of our people in Europe. We had lost 1/3 of our people. And the Arabs rejected this. And on May 15th, 1948, 7 Arab armies invaded. And this was not happening in a vacuum. You have to remember that from November 11th, 1947, a war had already started with the local Palestinians, Iraqi irregulars, and other troops from abroad that came in to fight the Palestinian jihad against the Jews and to throw them into the sea, to kill every Jew. In other words, a continuation of the Holocaust. And Israel, as a result of its war, expanded. So no longer were we talking about the 1947 partition, which was basically an impossible map. Israel would have been cut into 3 parts. And instead, Israel developed the borders of 1948-49. The Arabs rejected this as well. By the way, the Egyptians invaded in 1948. It took a year of bitter fighting until the summer of 1949 to defeat the Egyptian armies. And Israel basically went all the way to the Suez Canal. Not because we wanted to conquer the canal, not because we wanted to conquer Egypt, not because we wanted the Sinai Peninsula. Very simply, when you have armies moving around in the desert, if you don't take them out, those armies will come and attack you. If you don't take them out, they'll take you out. And so the Egyptian army was defeated in the independence war in 48-49. President Truman said to Israel, give Sinai back to Egypt. And frankly, Israel had so many other problems to deal with that, like I said before, it was never our plan to take Sinai in order to keep it. We only took Sinai in order to defeat the Egyptian forces. So President Truman said, withdraw. We withdrew. America is our greatest ally. 1956, by now, Gamal Abdel Nasser had become the president of Egypt, and he had a dream. He had a dream that he would be the one who would wipe out Israel off the face of the earth. And Abdel Nasser decided to do something. He decided to put in heavy artillery at the very, very tip of Sinai. And it's true that Sinai is Egyptian territory, but he was going to put in heavy artillery with which to bombard any Israeli ship that would come from Eilat going south to Africa or Asia. And so he blockaded what is called the Straits of Tiran. Blockading the Straits of Tiran basically is an act of war. Anyone who blocks off an international waterway, and you have to remember that the Straits of Tiran are shared by Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Israel. And blockading the Straits of Tiran is a casus belli, legally speaking, an act of war. And so Israel went in, took out those artillery guns, those artillery positions. Israel took Sinai, and in coordination with the British and the French, who took the Suez Canal, we basically defeated Egypt in another war. Don't forget also that Israel had been suffering from Fedayeen attacks. The Fedayeen were infiltrators who would come in and ambush buses and kill innocent civilians in settlements and in buses. So this was a straightening out of accounts with the Egyptians in 1956. And we reopened the Straits of Tiran. Now, at this same time, the Russians had invaded Hungary, and President Eisenhower had so many problems that he really did not need another confrontation with the Arab world. And so President Dwight Eisenhower said to the British and the French to return the Suez Canal to the Egyptian government, and Israel was commanded by the United States government to withdraw from Sinai a second time. Now, the Israelis said, you know what, it was never our intention to keep Sinai. It was just our intention to destroy the Egyptian army that was sitting on our borders ready to invade us. It was a preemptive war. And so the Israeli government received in writing a guarantee from President Dwight Eisenhower that if Israel withdraws from Sinai, the United States military takes it upon itself to ensure the opening and the maintenance of the Straits of Tiran as an open waterway for Israeli ships. The Egyptians do not have the right to shut off the Straits of Tiran. And so a few years went by, and Israel was out of Sinai, as it promised. And lo and behold, in 1967, the same president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, decides he wants to destroy the state of Israel again. And he sets up artillery positions again at the Straits of Tiran, shutting off the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. Again, casus belli, an act of war. And so the Israelis, before they acted, the Israelis had a written document, a written guarantee by the U.S., a commitment by the U.S. government to defend Israel, and that the President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, in 1967, was responsible for sending in the Sixth Fleet to reopen the Straits of Tiran. And we had a period of waiting, and we called it the period of waiting. We waited 3 weeks. We waited, we mobilized our troops, and our men were in the reserves. In other words, all the men in Israel were in the reserves, were in the army in uniform, waiting for a concerted invasion by the Egyptians because they had massed over 100,000 troops on the Israeli border. The Syrians were shelling the Golan in the north, and the Jordanians were shelling Jerusalem and other places. So Israel was waiting 3 weeks. And the answer we finally got back from Lyndon Baines Johnson and from the State Department was, sorry, Israel, we can't help you because we cannot find our copy of this written commitment. If you remember the commitment that Dwight Eisenhower gave to Israel in 1957, that America would defend Israel, would reopen the Straits of Tiran. This was a promise. This was a guarantee. This was a commitment in writing. And the U.S. was not keeping its word. And so Israel went into Egypt in the 67 war, the Six-Day War, to reopen the Straits of Tiran again. And Israel took Sinai a third time because Egypt was, in effect, at war with Israel. After 3 days of battle, Sinai was taken. The same troops were taken out of Sinai and then sent to Jerusalem and to the Jordanian front. In 2 days of war, the Jordanian military was defeated. And Israel said to King Hussein, you know, we don't have a problem with you. Why are you shelling Jerusalem? Please stop it, and we will not have a war with you. And King Hussein made an historic mistake, a fatal mistake. And he lost Jerusalem. He lost the West Bank, which we Jewish people call Judea and Samaria. And on the 6th day of the war, these same poor paratroopers who spent 3 days fighting for the Sinai and 2 days for Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, these same paratroopers were then sent up to the Golan Heights, and in a day and a half, the Syrian forces were defeated and Israel got the Golan. So now, as a result of the Arab intransigence, as a result of the Arab failure to recognize Israel and make peace, and as a result of the Arab position of attacking and attacking and attacking, Israel expanded into the Sinai, up to the Suez Canal, up to the Jordan River, and we took the Golan Heights, and we were basically only about 20 miles from Damascus, from the capital of Syria. As a result of all these conquests, the United Nations came out with a resolution called UN Resolution 242. UN Resolution 242 said that Israel should hand over land for peace, but Israel should now negotiate with its Arab neighbors for new borders which are secure, recognized, and defensible. I cannot emphasize this enough. The UN never, ever said to Israel to go back to the borders of 1967. The UN resolution said Israel will hand over land for peace, but Israel will negotiate for new borders which are secure, recognized, and defensible. Now, in spite of the UN resolution, Israel said to the Arabs, you know what, we'll give you everything back. Just make peace with us. And in the summer of 1968, at the Khartoum conference of the Arab League, the answer of the Arab nations was no recognition, no negotiations, no peace. So here, the government of Israel had offered everything back, and the Arabs said no. As a result of this decision, and as a result of a war, a secret war, that nobody really thinks about in America today, it was called the Attrition War. The War of Attrition lasted from 1968 to 1970, and we lost hundreds of our men in artillery exchanges with the Egyptians and with the Syrians. This was a terrible war. And the Israeli government of the Labor Party agreed that settlements should be established in Judea, Samaria, Gaza, Sinai, the Golan, because these settlements were all an integral part of Israel's defense posture. The Arabs were not ready to talk about peace, and so Israel had to set up these settlements as part of its defense of these territories. And a whole line of settlements were set up along the Jordan River and in the Golan Heights along the Syrian border and in Sinai. 1973, the Egyptians and Syrians sneak attacked Israel on Israel's holiest day, Yom Kippur. And the Egyptians were victorious the first few days. The Syrians were victorious the first few days. Israel was almost rolled back to the Sea of Galilee by the Syrians. And the Egyptians broke through Israel's lines on the Suez Canal and held on to their positions at the Suez Canal. Israel fought a very, very bitter war. This was a war that had the whole country mobilized for 6 months. We lost 5,000 of our men dead. We lost 5,000 of our men handicapped forever. This was a very painful war for the Jewish people. At the end of this war, Israel was now deep into Africa, deep into Egyptian territory. It was not only Sinai. We took Sinai a third time. We held on to Sinai now, and we were deep inside of Africa. We were only about 100 kilometers, about 60 miles from Cairo. And in the Golan Heights, we extended our hold of the Golan Heights, and we were even closer now to Damascus than we were before. So the UN came out with a resolution called UN Resolution 338. And UN Resolution 338 said that Israel should hand over land for peace, but Israel should negotiate with its Arab neighbors for new borders which are secure, recognized, and defensible. I have to emphasize these last three words: borders which are secure, recognized, and defensible. And so I said to these people in the Dallas Council on World Affairs that basically today, Israel has already handed over 93% of the lands that Israel was forced to take in wars of self-defense. If you remember, in June of 1974, Henry Kissinger came to the Middle East and negotiated between Israel and the Syrians, what was then called the disengagement talks. And Israel handed over half the Golan Heights to the Syrians. Now, half the Golan Heights was 2% of the land that Israel had taken. Then came to power in 1977 the Likud party for the first time under Menachem Begin, and Prime Minister Menachem Begin negotiated with the Egyptians for peace, and Israel handed over Sinai a third time to the Egyptians. That is 91% of the land. So we handed over 2%, 91%, it's 93%. What Israel was holding in April of 1991 was at that time 7% of the land that Israel was forced to take in wars of self-defense. Now we're making these tapes here, these sessions in Texas. And I don't imagine for a moment coming to the Texans or coming to the American people and making demands to give land over to Mexico, or give land back to France, Louisiana Purchase, or give land back to Spain and Florida, or with the British, or with Canada. Israel fought for its survival. Israel won. And today the whole world is demanding that Israel give everything up, even though Israel was attacked. And Israel is about to be attacked again by the Arabs. And we will talk about this in the fifth and final session, the war that is coming in the Middle East very soon. God forbid, but I feel it's coming. And that's why I'm making these tapes. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And when I say my people, I mean you, the American people, the Europeans, all Christians, all Jews. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. By the way, this message is for Hindus and Buddhists because they are also being destroyed by the Muslims. So Israel gave over 93% of the land. And I said to these people in Dallas, I said, you know, If you have a legal problem and you end up in court, either as defendant or a plaintiff, at some stage the judge says, come on guys, I want some kind of compromise here. Now, what's a compromise? You know, judges don't like to rule. Judges like an out-of-court compromise. What's a compromise? A compromise is 50-50, 60-40, 70-30, 80-20, 90-10. Israel compromised 93%. If the Arabs want peace, and the Arabs say that they recognize UN resolutions 242 and 338, if they want peace, they've got to compromise. And yet the Arabs say Israel must return to the borders of 67. And anyone who says that Israel must return to the borders of 1967 rejects UN resolutions 242 and 338. And this was my message. I explained to them that for Israel, from a military perspective, for Israel to withdraw from the Golan Heights, the half the Golan Heights that we still hold, that would mean the destruction of Israel, because Syria now would return to the shores of the Sea of Galilee. They could walk into Tiberias in 10 minutes. They could take Safed in half an hour. They could take Nazareth in 45 minutes, and they could reach Haifa on the sea within an hour. The Golan Heights are of supreme military strategic value for the state of Israel. If Israel withdraws from the Jordan River, it's like the Dutch boy pulling his finger out of the dike. There would be nothing to stop a 1 million man or a 10 billion man Muslim march on Jerusalem. You know, Jesus would come down from the Galilee. He would walk down to the Sea of Galilee, walk down the Jordan River. He would baptize near Jericho. Then, like the high priest in the temple did at that time. And then Jesus would walk up to Jerusalem from Jericho. It's a 5-hour hike. You can drive from the Jordan River to Jerusalem in 20 minutes. And you can fly from Amman Airport to Jerusalem and bomb Jerusalem in 3 minutes. And then bomb Tel Aviv in another 2 minutes, 5 minutes. And you can be back at the air base in Amman sipping Turkish coffee in another 5 minutes. Scramble time in the US Air Force is 11 minutes. So Israel doesn't have strategic depth with which to defend itself. Therefore, Israel cannot withdraw from the Jordan River. There cannot be a Palestinian entity connected physically with a common border with Jordan. Because any such entity with any such contiguity would mean the doors would be open to an invasion of Muslim volunteers, even if it was over a period of 10 years, a slow, quiet infiltration. And these people would build up their forces, and from Kalkilia and Tulkarem to the Mediterranean is a 9-mile easy hike. There is no weapon in the world that could stop that if Israel withdrew from the Jordan River. And as we are making these tapes at this very moment, there is fighting between Palestinians and the Israeli military in Rafah on the border with Egypt, because these people have dug tunnels over the last 10 years. During the peace process, they've been digging tunnels into Egypt and smuggling in Katyusha and other types of rockets and anti-aircraft missiles. And who knows what kind of weapons of mass destruction. Not only that, there have been Egyptians from Cairo who volunteered to be jihadis to fight against Israel. They came across the border through these tunnels, and they got killed fighting the Israelis. So you have international Islamic volunteers being funneled into Gaza through these tunnels, just like you have international volunteers funneled into Iraq to send home American body bags coming through from Syria, or Shiite Iranian Pasdaran revolutionary guards coming into Iraq from Iran under the guise of being pilgrims to Najaf and Karbala. But the bottom line is the same: to kill the Jews and to kill the Christians. And so I said in my message to the people of the Dallas Council on World Affairs, I said, you know, we understand also that there is a missile threat today, and Israel is ready to negotiate with its Arab neighbors for peace, because we understand that if missiles take off from Iran, or if missiles take off from Saudi Arabia or Syria or Egypt or Libya, physical borders on the ground do not stop missiles. So we understood that we are now facing a new generational threat to the state of Israel. And so I understood. I said, in Israel we have the Likud, we have the Labor Party. Both have different ideologies. But militarily speaking, Israel has to be ready to defend the borders physically with tanks, artillery, and troops, the aircraft. And we have to defend our country from incoming missiles. And therefore, we understand that borders do not stop missiles. And so the Labor Party is also right. The Israeli army cannot have favorites when it comes to military doctrine. The military doctrine of the Israeli army is to be ready to defend the country under what we call the right-wing or the left-wing ideologies. The vicissitudes of Israeli politics are such that our governments change every 2-3 years, and it goes from the Likud to the Labor, from Labor to the Likud, and so forth. That was my message. I think I gave them a very, very good presentation. I was applauded very modestly, very quietly, because it was not something these people wanted to hear. And then after I spoke, we had dinner. After we had dinner, I was getting ready to leave. They said, "Where are you going?" "We are not finished with you yet. Now we want to talk to you." Now, I don't know who these people thought I was. Maybe they thought I was the prime minister. Maybe they thought I was General Amnon Lipkin Shahak. And I'm just this lowly lieutenant in the Israeli army spokesman's office. And I was spoken to in the second session in a way that the prime minister would have been spoken to. I was very well respected, very well treated, but the meeting was brutal. And this meeting changed my life forever. And first, I want to go back a moment to November of 1990. If you remember, I was mentioning that I had been on Marlon Maddox. And the opening of the door for the Marlon Maddox Point of View program came about as a result of a very, very dear Christian man from Cleburne, Texas, Eric Gustafson. Eric Gustafson was a philanthropist, and he gave money to the Christian KVTT radio in Dallas, and invited me to a fundraiser. And it was at this fundraiser that I met Marlon Maddox. And so 6 months later, at this dinner that the One World Government was giving for me, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Dallas Council on World Affairs, I asked and I received permission to invite Eric and Evelyn Gustafson and their daughter Carol and her husband Dr. Burton, a dentist. And so at the meeting after the dinner, most of the people had left. There had been 200 people at the first meeting, and at the second closed meeting, there were 20 of the top most important people in America, financial people, economic people. And I was seated at a round, not a round table, at this big square table. And the Gustafsons were to my left, and Dr. Burton and his wife Carol were to my right. I had my 4 Christian guardian angels on my side, my 2 sides. And in front of us were the 20 people of the Dallas Council on World Affairs. And they said, "Avi, you're a good speaker for Israel. You know why? Because you're American-born. You don't speak with a funny Israeli accent. We understand everything it's trying to say." That's how the Israeli leadership speaks. They speak with a funny Jewish accent. And the Dallas Council people said to me, "We here in Dallas don't like funny accents." Tell that to the Northerners. Anyway, and the Dallas Council people said to me, "We don't like Russian accents," because Boris Yeltsin had been there. "We don't like Arabic accents," because they were always bringing Arabic speakers. "We don't like Israeli Jewish accents." And we don't like Queen's English from Oxford, England accents either. "And you speak like a Yankee," they said to me. "You're a Northerner. But you speak clearly, and we understand you. So you're a good speaker for Israel. You're not like the other Israeli diplomatic people whom we can't understand. But you have a problem. You don't know realities. And we of the Dallas Council on World Affairs, we are going to teach you realities tonight. 2 realities. Reality number 1, Israel is all alone. You Jews are going to make peace with the Arabs whether you like it or not. And we're tired of paying for your wars. We helped you in 73. We gave you an airlift, which saved you, which is true. We got an airlift from America. It saved us in 73. And they said, "We will never, ever again give you an airlift. You Israelis are all alone. You are completely on your own. So you're going to make peace with the Arabs whether you like it or not. And you're going to give them not 91%, not 93%, and not even 100%. Whatever the Arabs want, you're going to give it to them because you're all alone. You have no choice." Is that clear? And we don't even care about UN resolutions 242 and 338. What does it mean? It means that these people reject UN resolutions 242 and 338. And secondly, they said to me, besides, you have to understand one thing. There's only one thing that made America great, and that's the barrel of oil, the steady price of oil, the steady supply of oil. And we're not going to let the Jews get in the way of that. And that's all they had to say to me. Now, before I could answer, and to tell you the truth, I was traumatized by what they said to me. I'd never heard something like this before. This was an experience that changed my life forever. And I said to these, before I could speak to these people, Eric Gustafson was shaking like a tuning fork, and he got up and he was red in the face, and he looked at these people and said, before Avi responds, can I respond? And they said, yeah, we're finished with you guys, because they understood that I was the Jew who loves the Christians, and these were the Christians who loved the Jews, and that we together were fighting the Lord's battle for Israel. And Eric Gustafson looked at them and said, you call yourselves Christians? You say that what made America great was the barrel of oil, the steady price of oil, the steady supply of oil? That's what made America great? You should be ashamed of yourselves. What made America great was not the barrel of oil. What made America great was Jesus Christ. And he sat down. And then his daughter, Carol Burton, got up, and she looked at them and said, besides, it says in the Bible, those who bless Israel are blessed, and those who curse Israel are cursed. And she sat down. And then I got up, and I said to them, listen, guys, we Jews never got in the way of your steady oil supplies and your steady oil prices. And in fact, we paid for your oil with 6 million of our people. The Arabs already knew the strength that oil gave them. In the 1930s and 1940s, the Arabs were warning England and were warning the United States of America that if the Jews would be allowed to emigrate from Nazi-occupied Europe to Palestine, to Israel, that the Arabs would go over and support Hitler. And not only did the British stop the emigration to Palestine, they wouldn't allow Jews to go to England, except for a few thousand children called the Kinder Transport. These were allowed to go to England. But the parents stayed in Germany and they died. And the United States had a gentleman by the name of Breckinridge Long. Breckinridge Long was the Undersecretary of State for visas in the State Department. He was responsible for issuing or not issuing visas. There were 6 million Jews trapped in Nazi-occupied Europe. And the Arabs did not want them in Palestine. The Arabs did not want them in England or in America or anywhere. The Arabs, the Muslims, wanted the Jews dead. And the Arabs got what they wanted. There was a Holocaust because Hitler killed them, but there was a Holocaust because the Jews could not get visas. They could not get visas because of the Arab decision to make sure that the United States would do as it was told by the Arab oil countries. I don't know if you remember, there was a ship, a German ship, that sailed from the port of Hamburg in Germany in May of 1939. The ship was carrying 900 Jews from Germany with valid passports and valid visas to Cuba. The ship arrived in Cuba, and all of a sudden there was an announcement that the U.S. State Department had pressured, under Breckinridge Long, had pressured the Cuban government to revoke the visas. Now all of a sudden the Jews could not get off the ship because the U.S. State Department wanted to make sure to it that the Jews on this ship would be sent back to their deaths in Germany. The ship's name was the St. Louis. The ship sailed from Cuba, came to the American shoreline just off of the Fort Lauderdale, and the U.S. Coast Guard made sure to it that no Jews would be able to jump ship and swim to the shore. You know, like today you have the Haitians and the Cubans who swim or float across to the United States. No Jew, no mercy. No Jews were allowed in the United States of America. The ship then went up to Canada, and Prime Minister Mackenzie of Canada also made sure to it that no Jews would get off the ship in Canada. No mercy. And today the Canadians are bringing in millions and millions of Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims because the country's empty. They want to encourage immigration because Canada is empty. And had Canada taken in 6 million Jews in World War II, Canada today would be a powerful country like America, instead of a third-rate, third-world country. And it hurts me to say that about Canada, because I preach in Canada. I love the Canadians. I love their churches. They're good Christian people, but they have a very messed up leadership in league with many of the European socialist governments. And so the ship was sent back to Nazi Germany, and of the 900 people on the ship, over 800 met their deaths in the Mauthausen concentration camp. And I said to the people of the Dallas Council on World Affairs, what you're saying in essence is that Israel will be sacrificed to the Arabs for a barrel of oil. And they said yes. I said, what you're saying in essence is that there's going to be another Holocaust, and that 5 million, 6 million Jews living in Israel today will die. Because to sacrifice Israel, to make it go back to the borders of '67, would mean another war, another invasion by the Arabs, and Israel would have borders that it could not defend. And they said to me, yes, there will be another Holocaust. And these good Americans were saying that the Jews have to die. And I said to them, never again. But more important than never again, I came to a very, very clear understanding of the geopolitical realities in this country. That there are two types of Americans. There are the Christians, and there are the anti-Christians. There are the Christians, and I'm a Jew. There are Christians who love Christ. And they love Christ, and they love the Bible, and they love God, and they love Israel, and they love the Jews. These are the people I love. And then there are the anti-Christians, the money people, the people who serve mammon. Mammon means money. And Jesus teaches, you cannot have two masters. Either you serve the Lord or you serve mammon. People are going to have to make a choice in America. And I made a choice as a Jew to support the Christians that love God, love the Bible, love Israel, and yes, love Jesus Christ, because it's a package. And those people who love oil and love mammon, these are the people who, under Roosevelt, were accomplices to the Holocaust, who were partners in Hitler's extermination, together with the Arabs, of the Jews. And I decided in 1991 in April, and this testimony is in all three of my books. I've repeated it because it made such a change in my life. I used to hate Christians. I spoke about this in my very, very first seminar. That's why it's so important to see the first seminar as well, about love. I used to hate the Christians, and now I fell madly in love with Christians because I understood that there are going to be two types of people in this country. They're going to be Christians, and they're going to be anti-Christians. And I was going to throw my lot in with the Christians. And so my second book, by the way, this is in 1991. My second book came out in 1999, but the name was brewing in my mind for 8 years. Christian Revival for Israel's Survival. Israel cannot survive. It will not survive without the Christians being with us. And I dedicated my life ever since to work with the Christians. And, you know, I go to churches, and people come up to me and say, you know, Avi, you know, we're Christians. We love God, we love the Bible, we love Christ, and we love the Jews, and we love Israel. And we're ready to give our lives for Israel. And you know what I answer them now? I'm a Jew. I'm not a Christian. I'm not a Messianic. But I love the Christians. I love the Messianics. And I'm ready to give my life for a Christian revival for Israel's survival. Because if you Christians don't have a revival, Israel will be lost. And if Israel is lost to the Jews, it is lost to the Christians. And we're going to talk about some very, very serious things when we get to the final seminar about Islamic plans to attack Israel and to kill all the Jews, to kill all the Christians. And you know what? To kill all the Muslim Palestinians too. Because after all, they'll just be collateral damage in the final war in which Israel gets erased from the face of the earth. That's what the Muslims sincerely believe. So this testimony changed my life forever. There used to be a time that for me to see a cross made me so angry. Many Jews feel like that today. And when I'd see a cross on a church steeple, I'd get angry. And even when I heard Christmas carols, I'd get angry as a Jew. It's one of the reasons why I moved to Israel. Today, I'm madly in love with the churches, and of all churches, of all denominations. And as a Jew, I can go to any Christian denomination and to love them. And so my life now is dedicated to helping the Christians to awaken, to have a revival. Because this country today, the United States of America, is a very sick place. And Christians, even though Christians are, I would say, 66%, two-thirds of the country, but the people who control the media are not Christians. They are people who serve mammon. And the mammon does not come from the Jews or the Christians. The mammon comes from the Islamic petrodollars. So this is a testimony which it's taken me almost 45 minutes just to talk about this testimony. And I want to go into one or two other testimonies to share with you. I was sharing this testimony in the Pacific Northwest in a church, and the pastor there had been in the U.S. Navy before. And after I had spoken about the Dallas Council on World Affairs, he says, you know, I have a testimony for you. And we sat down, and he told me the testimony. And he had been in the U.S. Navy. He had committed some very, very heroic acts in the U.S. Navy. And he was considered for promotion as an officer in the U.S. Navy. And as an officer in the U.S. Navy, he would, you know, spend the rest of his life in the Navy, and he loved the Navy. And before officer course, they asked him a question. It's called the loyalty exam. What would you do if you were captain of this ship and you were given orders from Washington to nuke Israel, to launch a nuclear strike at Tel Aviv? And this sailor in the U.S. Navy started to laugh. And they asked him, why are you laughing? This is a very serious question. And he said, because firstly, he said, I'm a Christian. God has made promises in the Bible, and God is not a liar. God will protect Israel. God will never allow Israel to be nuked. And secondly, I would not want to be on that ship on that day that the orders were given for a U.S. Navy ship to nuke Tel Aviv, because God would take out the nuclear weapon and God would take out the ship. I would not want to be on that ship. And his career in the Navy was terminated. And you know what? There were 3 other guys on the same ship with him. And they're pastors also today. All 4 of them became pastors. And a year or so later, I was in Texas, completely different part of the country. And I told this testimony in a church in Texas. And the pastor said, you know, I was in the Navy too. And I was also asked the same question, too. And I said the same answer, and I was also terminated in the U.S. Navy. Because if you're a Christian and your first loyalty is to God, then the leadership of the United States, which is not a godly leadership, you'll be terminated. So this is a very important testimony. I don't know if it's true that the U.S. would be capable of nuking Israel if it decided, if there were people in Washington who decided to do it. But we do have a problem today. Are Americans a godly people? Are Americans supposed to be a godly people? Or are Americans supposed to be yes men? Now, by the way, you know, part of my work is to travel, mostly driving, sometimes flying, mostly driving around the U.S., Canada. I go into churches, sometimes really small churches, really poor churches, churches that no very famous person would ever go to. And I get paid an offering. Sometimes the offering is $100, $200. I don't do this for money. I do this for God. I do this for Israel. I do this for my family, that we should not be nuked, that we should not be destroyed, to create a Christian revival so that Israel will survive. So when I go to the churches, people come up to me and they say to me, especially during the 8 years of the Clinton administration, and Christians say to me, you know, we were U.S. military, we were law enforcement, we were intelligence, we were in the U.S. administration in one form or another, but because we were Christians and because we pointed the finger at the threat of Islam, we were terminated. And the people who were promoted under the Clinton administration were yes men who believed in Clinton's way of thinking, hey, it's the economy, stupid. In other words, not Christians, who say, no, stupid, it's not the economy, it's God. Now, what I want to do is, I want to start talking a little bit about the Islamic plans for America. Now, in my third session, I spoke about terrorism. I mentioned the revolutions of 1979 and how they impacted the United States of America through violence. What I want to do today is to talk about the nonviolent form of Islam. So I say there are two forms of Islam. You have revolutionary or violent Islam, which is Saddam Hussein, Ayatollah Khomeini, Yasser Arafat, and then you have the nonviolent Islam. These are people who are peacekeeping, law-abiding people who come to live in America as immigrants. And I want to talk about that a little bit. Before I talk about that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Jewish people in the United States of America. Now, you have to remember, I was born in the United States in 1949. I was raised in the United States. I left for Israel in 1968 when I was 19 years old. And you know, we were very proud as young Jewish people in the 1950s because the Jewish people in America numbered 6 million. You had the Christians, number one, and you had the Jews, number two. For 400 years, America was a Judeo-Christian country. I moved to Israel. I gave the reasons in my first speech, my first seminar. And it was during the 35 years that I lived in Israel that I also traveled to the United States, and I always maintained contacts, and I was always following the realities of American life, Jewish life in America. And I was also very, very aware that America enjoyed a tremendous influx of Jewish people in the last 35 years. And that indeed 1 million Jews immigrated to the United States from Russia, 1 million Jews immigrated to the United States from Israel, 1 million Jews immigrated to the United States from all the other countries of the earth. So you're talking about 3 million. So how much is 6 million Jews who are already here and 3 million? Should be 9 million. Natural reproduction, the Jews should be 10, 11, 12 million people. How many Jews are there in America in the year 2004? Maybe 5 million, maybe 4.5 million. So if the Jews were supposed to be 12 million or 11 million or 10 million or 9 million, where are all the millions of Jews who disappeared? And I have to tell you something, as a Jew, I speak in all Christian churches. And very often I get attacked in Jewish synagogues. Why am I going to the Christians? The Christians are the enemy. The Christians want to convert us to Christianity. Especially, you know, they say the Southern Baptist Convention talks about converting the Jews to Christianity. And of course, the biggest enemy, as perceived by the Jewish community, are the Messianics. The Messianics are the great enemy. This is the enemy. That's why the Jews disappeared in America. And I say to myself, really? Let's look at it. The Messianics are somewhere between 100 to 200,000 people. But the Jews lost 6, 7, 8 million people. So you can't blame the Messianics. And the Baptist Convention cannot claim more than a few thousand converts. So the Jewish people are ignoring the real reason for the disappearance of the Jewish people on American soil. And I have some suggestions. The Jewish people, especially the liberals, the Democrats, believe in abortion, that a woman has a right to do with her body whatever she wants. Not the Orthodox Jews, mind you, but the liberals. The liberals support the homosexual agenda, and it breaks my heart as a Jew that the liberal Jews support the homosexual agenda. Because God's word says that homosexuality is an abomination. The Orthodox Jews oppose the homosexual agenda. But the Orthodox Jews in America are 10, 15%, maybe 20%. And finally, I'm going to suggest to you an idea that very few people are willing to admit. And that is, there is a new religion that has seduced the Jewish people, and it's called the career. You know, the Jewish people in Europe were blocked and in the Arab world were blocked from many professions. But America only blessed its Jews. But sometimes too much of a blessing becomes a curse. Jews came to America, and all of a sudden they could be in any profession that they desired. Jews can be doctors, Jews can be lawyers, Jews can be businessmen, Jews can be military, in the US military, Jews can be astronauts, Jews can be politicians, Jews can go into any field that they want in America. There's only one problem. There is a price to be paid. To become the highest in any field, you've got to go through a BA, MA, and a doctoral thesis, and then postgraduate to be the state-of-the-art, top of the class, king of the hill. And Jews go after the career with a vengeance. The career has become a religion for Jewish people. The synagogue, Judaism, the Sabbath, the kosher laws, the family are all shunted aside. And like I said before, in America, you can do anything in America, but there's a price. You want to go to university until you're 30, 35, or 40 to be the greatest specialist in your field, you can do it. You've got to take hundreds of thousands of dollars in loans, and then you've got to pay off the loans. And you really cannot get married. You have to live a life, I won't say of celibacy, but you cannot get married. Because to be married, you have to be with your wife and your children, or if it's the case of a woman, women with the career in America is a big plague. Because women today, instead of bearing children, they have a career. And so Jewish men and women basically last as bachelors, unmarried, till they're 30, 35, 40, and then by then they cannot have children. They marry non-Jewish spouses with whom they have a lot in common through their work. And so the Jews basically, because of abortion, homosexuality, and the career, the Jews have vaporized into thin air in America by failure to reproduce. So today the Jews in America are somewhere between 4.5 to 5 million. Please, Jews, don't blame the Southern Baptist Convention. Don't blame the Messianics. They're not the reason. The real reason for the Jewish disappearance in America is Jewish failure to marry and reproduce. And so the Jews have shrunk. You know, there are a number of stories in American history. There are myths. Once President Truman was a good president. President Truman supported the creation of the State of Israel. Now, I don't know how much you know about your American political history, but if you remember, after World War II, when Europe was destroyed, we had the Marshall Plan. And Marshall was a Secretary of State. And when Truman decided in November of 1947 to create the State of Israel, to support the creation of the State of Israel, George Marshall came over to Truman and said, "We don't need a Jewish state. We have a Cold War now. We need the Arabs on our side." Exactly what happened in the war with Hitler, where we needed the Arabs on our side during the war with Hitler. And Truman said, "I'm going to support the State of Israel." He said, "Why?" George Marshall said, "Why are you going to support Israel? This is going to damage us." And Truman said to him, 6 million Jewish votes. Again, the Jews in 1948 were 6 million in America. November 1947, we were 6 million. May 1948, the State of Israel, praise God, was created. November 1948 were the presidential elections. And if you remember, Thomas Dewey was the favorite. The polls predicted that Thomas Dewey would defeat Truman by a landslide. And there was the famous picture of Harry Truman holding up a newspaper, and the newspaper said, "Dewey defeats Truman, by 100,000 votes." When the fact was that Truman won by 100,000 votes. Why? Because of the 6 million Jews, the Democrats, who voted as a bloc to support Harry Truman. Those who bless Israel are blessed, and those who curse Israel are cursed. Harry Truman blessed Israel, and created the state of Israel. And so he was reelected. The Jews voted for Truman. Now, one of the negative spin-offs of this story is that a myth developed in America, a myth that the Jews control American politics, that the Jews control the banks, the Jews control the military. And it's a myth, it's not true. But it came about as a result of this fluke in American political history of how much of a difference a group of 6 million people can make in America to get a president elected. I want to go back for a moment to Israel. As I said before, Israel was attacked viciously by Arab armies 6 times. The plan of the Islamic armies was not just to defeat Israel and negotiate a peace. The plan of the Islamic armies was the annihilation of every Jew and Christian on the land of Israel. After the war of 1973, I think the Arabs came to a conclusion. It's going to be very hard to defeat Israel militarily. We as Arabs, we as Muslims, have to think of other ways to defeat Israel. We cannot do it militarily, at least not just yet. And so the Arabs looked and saw that the United States was standing with Israel. If the United States is standing with Israel, Israel will not be defeated. And the Arab strategy, especially after the revolutions of 1979, which, like I said before, I spoke about in my 3rd seminar, the decision was taken in the Islamic world, in Iran, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the Palestinians, the Saudis, the Egyptians, that a new strategy had to be developed. Part of the strategy was the strategy of Anwar Sadat in 1977 to make peace with Israel in order to get back the Sinai a 3rd time. And he succeeded in his strategy. There is a joke, and it's not really a very funny joke, but it's a very instructive joke. The joke is about the Bandung Peace Conference in 1955. Bandung was a city in Burma, which was where the 3rd world nations were meeting. And you had countries like China, Mao Zedong came, Nehru of India came, Abdel Nasser of Egypt, and Tito of Yugoslavia. These were not countries that belonged either to the capitalist West or the communist Soviet system. And so the joke is that Abdel Nasser of Egypt, whom I mentioned before, who waged war against Israel a number of times, is supposedly here sitting down with Mao Zedong over a cup of coffee, and he's crying on his shoulder and saying, "Oh, I have such a headache from this enemy of mine, of Israel." And Mao Zedong looks at Abdel Nasser and says, "Your enemy is Israel? Very interesting. How many are they? How many Israelis are they, this enemy of yours?" And Abdel Nasser in 1955, so he says, 2 million. 2 million Israelis. So Mao Zedong says to Abdel Nasser of Egypt, "Oh, your enemy is Israel, 2 million. Tell me, what hotel are they staying at?" You see, because for the Chinese, who are over 1 billion people, they can't understand an enemy of 2 million people. What's an enemy of 2 million people? What hotel are they staying at? And so I think that the Islamic world learned from this joke. And the Islamic world looked at America in 1948, 1956, 67, 73, that Israel could not be beaten as long as America stood with Israel. And then they looked and they saw 6 million Jews or 5 million Jews. And the Islamic world said, what hotel are the Jews of America staying in? What's 5 million Jews? We Muslims can find ways to get into the United States of America and outnumber the Jews. And if there are 5 million Jews, if we bring in 10 million, 15 million, 20 million, 30 million, 50 million Muslims into America, who are the Jews? The Jews will be rendered irrelevant. The Jews will be marginalized. And this will no longer be a Judeo-Christian country. America will become a Judeo-Christian Islamic country, which is what happened under Bill Clinton. And then eventually, America will become a Christian Islamic country, no more Judeo. And then eventually America will become just simply an Islamic country. And so as a result of the revolutions of 1979, decisions were made in the Islamic world. You look at the Islamic world, you see the deserts. There are not too many natural resources in the Islamic countries. And you have deserts because the Muslims have destroyed their lands and turned them into deserts. They are not turning their deserts green like the Jews and the Christians do. They have all this oil wealth. And you tell me, what industry do you see in the Islamic world other than oil, which, by the way, was built by the Westerners, by foreign investors? What industry is there in the Islamic world? What economies do the Arab countries have? The countries are miserable. There is no economy. There is no democracy. And so Islamic families have 10, 12 kids, and there's no way to feed them. So what do? They export the children to the United States, to Canada, to South America, to Europe, because the pastures literally are greener in the Christian world and in Israel, the Jewish world. And what I want to do now is to discuss a little bit how Islam peacefully is taking over America, how Islam peacefully is taking over Canada, how Islam peacefully is taking over Europe, and how Islam manipulates the United Nations to its purposes, and how the one world government, the harlot riding the dragon of Islam, is helping them. Let's take an example. Duke University, Chapel Hill in North Carolina. One example. Duke University is a good university. It's not Ivy League, but it's a good university. And one day, such and such Saudi prince comes to visit Duke University, meets with the dean, the rector, the board, and presents them with a check for $23 million. No strings attached. Does that get the attention of the university? You better believe it. And then the Saudi prince says to them, you know, we really love this university. We have a lot of respect for you. Here we have just given you $23 million. And we think that it would really be good if this university established an Islamic studies chair, Arabic and Islamic studies chair. And we know that it's not easy for a university to establish a chair, and we will give you another check for $23 million, conditional on establishing an Islamic and Arabic studies chair. So now, we're not talking about $23 million, we're talking about $46 million. And they go on. And we understand that Americans know very little about Islam, and we will help you. We will provide for you the teachers, the professors, commonly known as missionaries. We will provide for you the textbooks and all the teaching aids that you need. And we will give you 500 Muslim male students a year. These students will pay full room, board, and tuition. And they will tutor your students in Arabic. And they will help your students to understand the Middle East a little better. Now you tell me, if you're the dean, rector, or board of a university, and you're offered $23 million and $23 million, and then 500 students a year paying full room, board, and tuition, and everything is being supplied for you to be able to teach Islam and to teach Arabic, are you going to say no? Of course you're going to say yes. And so in the first year, 500 male students come, 18-year-olds. In the second year, you now have the former freshmen who become sophomores and 500 new freshmen. So now you have 500 and 500 students. In the third year, you now have 500 freshmen, 500 sophomores, and 500 juniors. And in the fourth year, you've got 2,000 Muslim students on campus paying full room, board, and tuition. And these young boys, they have testosterone just like any other boys, and they need girls. And the Islamic religion preaches that Christian women, Jewish women, are fair game for Muslim men. Muslim men can date and marry Christian women and Jewish women, and one of the deceptions of Islam that I did not cover is that they say our men, we don't hate Jews and Christians, our men can marry your women, but not vice versa. Any Muslim woman who tries to date or even speak to a Christian or Jewish man could meet a death sentence. That's what it says in the Quran. So you have 2,000 male students looking for Christian women, and what happens is that they marry the Christian women or the Jewish women, American women, and within 2 to 3 years, these men have American passports. Once they have American passports, they bring in their mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and uncles and aunts and cousins, and the only thing that the INS, Immigration and Naturalization Service, wants is some kind of a financial bond that these people will not become a burden on the U.S. taxpayers. So let's go back a moment. You've got a university now after 4 years with 2,000 male students, 500 a year coming in. Is it feasible that there are 1,000 universities out there in the U.S. getting money from the Saudis or other Islamic countries? And you multiply 1,000 universities times 500 male students a year. And you know what you have? 500,000 Muslim immigrants coming into the U.S. every year. And this is very clearly arithmetic growth. Then comes in the testosterone. And these men start marrying American women and getting American passports. And these women start bearing children who, by the way, are going to be Muslim children by Islamic law. And then they start bringing in their family members under family reunification. And all of a sudden now, you have geometric growth, exponential growth of Islam in the United States of America. And that's how you can begin to understand how Islam went from 0 30 years ago to 10, 15, or perhaps even 20 million people today in the United States, 20 million Muslims. And it's a sad laugh that the Jews keep saying we're 6 million, we're 6 million, we're 6 million, when the Jews are vaporizing into thin air by choice, when the Jews today are really 5 million or 4 million. And the Muslims today, the Arab Immigrant Association alone claims 7 million people. The Iranians in America, good people, are 2.5 million. So right there, Iranians and Arabs are 10 million. We have here today in America over 15 to 20 million people, I believe. So now the Jews are not the number 2 anymore. You have Christians, Muslims are the number 2, 10, 15, 20 million. Jews are 4 million. The Jews in 30 years are no longer the number 2. America, de facto, America today no longer is a Judeo-Christian country. America today is a Judeo-Christian Islamic country, emphasis on Islam. I spoke in a church in Jacksonville, Florida, and while I was speaking, I looked at the pastor and asked him, tell me, Pastor, how many born-agains are there in America today? And the pastor looked at me very seriously. He said about 2,000. 2,000 born-agains in America. Now, that's not funny. There are about 20, 25, maybe 30 million born-agains in America today. Think for a moment. 30 million born-agains and 4 million Jews is 34 million. In another 10, 15 years from now, by the year 2015, 2020, there will be more Muslims in America than born-agains and Jews. What does that say about the spiritual life in America? What does that say about the spiritual leadership in America? What does that say about the direction America is going to go regarding the state of Israel? So the writing is on the wall. Israel's time is very limited. Israel's time is ticking away. We're living on borrowed time. Because as the Muslims grow in America, the position of Israel will get weaker and weaker and weaker. And the position of the Christians will get weaker and weaker and weaker. I want to tell you a little testimony right here in Texas. I was in Brownsville, Texas, and it was a Word of God church. And at the end of my speech, a Christian woman got up to ask a question. Why do Muslim men marry Christian women? And I said, listen, I'm not here to talk against intermarriage, because genes, opposites attract. And, in America, there is also this mystique about Rudolph Valentino, the Sheik of Araby. And this tall, dark, handsome prince sweeps this naive, dreamy American girl off her feet and carries her off to the Kasbah to make passionate love. Firstly, I want to tell you, if you're an American woman, you don't want to go to the Kasbah to make passionate love. And anyway, but I said, you have to remember that the Muslim men go by different rules. Firstly, Muslim men can marry 4 women. Now, I don't know how many of you watching this program or listening to this tape or CD may remember the name Lorena Bobbitt. Lorena Bobbitt was a woman who took very, very seriously her husband's marital vows not to have another woman. But if an American woman marries a Muslim, he not only can, but he is commanded to have 4 wives if he can afford it. And if American women marry Muslim men and go back to the Muslim countries from which they came, that's the end of them, because their children will be Muslim by law. Here in America, children are free to do anything they want, not in Islamic countries. And I received a very interesting piece of information from Women Aglow, that 10,000 children of these mixed marriages of American women and Muslim men, 10,000 children have been kidnapped by the Muslim fathers back to the Middle East, and there is nothing the mothers can do to get their children back. And the State Department sides with the men, with the Muslims, for the obvious reasons. And I told a little story about Nizar Hindawi. Nizar Hindawi was a Palestinian Muslim who was living in London, working in a hotel, and he met an Irish woman, cleaning woman in the hotel. They had an affair. She got pregnant. And when she was 8 months pregnant, he said to her, the time has come for us to marry, and I want you to go to Palestine to meet my parents so that they may approve you. After they approve you, we will get married. So this Irish woman was very pleased. She wanted to have a father for her son. And so this Palestinian guy, Nizar Hindawi, takes his wife-to-be to Heathrow Airport to catch a plane to Israel. And the El Al security sees her big belly, and they say, we see you're about to give birth. Isn't it dangerous to fly in a plane? And where are you going? And she said, I'm going to Palestine to meet my future in-laws. When she said Palestine, obviously all the red lights started blinking and all the red flags started flying. And they said, what do you mean, you're not married? She said, no. Where's your fiance? Bring him over. And so this Palestinian, Nizar Hindawi, came over and he started sweating under interrogation, which is a suspect sign. Of course, the Israeli El Al security opened up the suitcase and they found an altitude bomb set to go off at 20,000 feet. In other words, this Palestinian guy, Nizar Hindawi, was not only going to blow up his own wife-to-be, which is, I suppose, okay, but he was going to blow up his own baby in her womb. Nizar Hindawi was going to kill his own son in her womb. But of course, in the Quran, it says, thou shalt not kill any man whom Allah has not deemed that you should kill, except for a just cause. And it is a just cause for a Muslim to blow up an El Al airliner with 450 people. So he was going to kill his own wife-to-be and his own baby. That's a just cause to blow up an El Al plane. Anyway, as I was speaking, my wife Rachel was in the front row of the church, and I saw this very pretty young 18-year-old blonde Texas girl talking in a very, very passionate talk with my wife. And all of a sudden, to my left, there were a man and a woman coming up to me with their hands in the air, crying, save our daughter, save our daughter. I said, I'm a Jew from Israel. I'm not here to save anybody. And they said, no, 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 you don't understand. Our daughter goes to the University of Texas in Austin. And we bought her a plane. Because from Brownsville to Austin is about an hour, hour and a half flight, but by driving, it's 7 hours. And so she flies to school. And at this school in Austin, she met a Saudi Arabian prince, very rich, has a palace back in Saudi Arabia. And she was upgrading her pilot's license to twin-engine plane. And it was at the flight school she met the Saudi prince. And he immediately proposed to her. And he was a very, very handsome guy. and very rich. Like I said before, the mystique of the tall, dark, handsome prince, Rudolph Valentino, sweeping this naive American woman off her feet, proposed to her on the first meeting. And even she said to him, you know, I can't even fly a plane in Saudi Arabia. I can't even drive a car in Saudi Arabia. And he said to her, you wouldn't have to fly. We would give you first class tickets on any airliner. You wouldn't have to drive because we have a limousine and we have a chauffeur, and he would take you anywhere you want to go. It's called the Golden Cage, the Golden Cage. Because living in Saudi Arabia with all this wealth, you are in a cage, especially if you're a woman. And so the pastor and my wife and I and the parents of this young girl sat down with her, and we said to her, listen, if you marry a Muslim man and you go back to the Middle East with him, he can and he must have 4 wives, if he can afford it. He's commanded in the Quran to have 4 wives. Here in America, if a man has a second woman, the wife can divorce him by law, not in the Middle East. Your children will be Muslims by law. No debate about this. In the Middle East, your children by Islamic law must be Muslims. And thirdly, one day your husband will come to you and say, you know, darling, I love you. I spend all my money on you. I've proven my love to you. And what's so bad about being a Muslim? I'm a Muslim. Am I bad to you? Are my people bad to you? So why don't you just convert, become a Muslim? Now, if you say no to your husband, you're being disobedient. Because in the Middle East, men are in control, and the women's job is to be obedient. And it says in chapter 4, verse 34 of the Quran, Allah created men superior to women. He granted them authority because he created men superior to women. Good women are obedient. If you fear disobedience in your women, because they've got 4, admonish them, send them to beds apart, and beat them. Now, I didn't talk about this in my seminar about Islam. But you see, nowhere in the Judeo-Christian Bible does it command men to beat women. But in the Quran, it's chapter 4, verse 34. Admonish them, send them to beds apart, and beat them. It doesn't say if your wife is disobedient. It says if you fear disobedience. And that's why women are so maltreated, so mistreated in the Islamic world. Because it is a command from the Quran to beat women. And sometimes to kill women. And my wife and I said to this woman, if your husband says to you to convert and you don't convert, the Saudi police might find your body wrapped up in chains at the bottom of the royal swimming pool. And they're not going to ask any questions. Because your life, once you leave the holy land of the United States of America to go to an Islamic country, your life as a woman, as a Christian woman, is not worth very much. And praise God, this young 18-year-old girl broke up with this Saudi prince, did not marry him. 5 years went by. I went back to the Rio Grande Valley, to Brownsville. This time I was speaking in a Messianic group. And who shows up? This girl, but she's not a girl anymore. Now she's 23, 24. She's put on some weight, but still she's blonde, she's pretty. And now she's studying to be a veterinarian. Now she has a twin-engine plane. She flies around Texas. She goes to farms. She takes care of horses and cows and pigs and donkeys and sheep and goats. And she loves to be a vet. She loves animals. And she's still studying at the University of Texas. And she says to me, you know, I have a new testimony for you. Everywhere I go, there are young men, Muslim students. And they all invite me out to the most exclusive restaurants in Austin. And you know, Austin is the capital of Texas, so you've got some pretty, really, really good restaurants there. And these Muslim men wine her and dine her in the most expensive restaurants. They never touch her. They respect her. But they always pop the question, will you marry me? And so this woman says, you know, I'm a doctor, I'm a vet, I have a very independent life. I fly a plane, I drive a car, And I know that if I go with you guys back to Saudi Arabia, I won't be able to fly a plane, drive a car, and I probably won't be able to work anymore. And so I'm really not sure I'm just yet ready to get married. And so the Arab guy says to her, well, if you don't want to marry me, maybe you want to marry my brother? If you don't want to marry my brother, maybe you want to marry somebody else in our group? And she came to the understanding, the amount of money that these men have to spend on Christian women to wine them and dine them and marry them, that there is an agenda. Again, you have to remember, I drive around the United States and I am constantly picking up information like a private investigator. Islam is entering this country with a purpose. And the purpose is not necessarily a violent purpose to destroy America. It could be a peace-loving, law-abiding Muslim who comes here with a purpose to Islamicize America. And in my book, Christian Revival for Israel's Survival, I provide a quote there that I received from Women Aglow, from Hayward, California, the Daily Review newspaper. This is not a Christian newspaper. July 4th, 1998. And in this quote, Omar Ahmed of the Council on American Islamic Relations is quoted as saying, Islam is not in America merely to be equal to any other religion, but to become the dominant religion. The book, the Quran, the book of Islam, should be the supreme scripture in America, replacing the Bible, and Islam the only accepted religion on earth. This is Omar Ahmed, July 4th, 1998. Islam is not here to be just like any other religion, but to become the dominant religion. Islam has a plan for America. And part of the plan, which has been brilliant and has succeeded until now, is to bring into this country 10, 15, 20 million Muslims. And they come in as students. They come in on false passports through the airports. And they also come across smuggled in from Mexico and from Canada. That's why I think that there are at least 20 million Muslims in America. And the Jews are outnumbered 3 to 1, 4 to 1. The Jews are going to become increasingly marginalized and irrelevant. And if you're a politician today in Detroit or in the areas where the Muslims have so many numbers, you're not going to cater to the Jewish vote if you're an American politician. You're going to cater to the Islamic vote because these people now have the numbers. The Jewish constituency in America is shrinking. The Islamic constituency is growing at an exponential rate. The Muslims now have the foot soldiers in America. They have the numbers. They have the oil in the Middle East. They have the petrodollars. They have the political power. They have the UN with them. And things are fixing in America for a shift towards Islam. Now you begin to understand why I'm sharing all of these things, because Israel today is facing up against a new political reality in America. And the new political reality in America is that the Jews don't count anymore, and the Muslims do. I want to talk now a little bit about Islamic infiltration from Mexico. Like I said before, I have spent a lot of time in Texas. I've also spent a lot of time in the Rio Grande Valley. And I was in another church in Brownsville. And there I picked up some interesting testimonies. I picked up a testimony that there is a house of detention in South Texas called Casa Romero. And Casa Romero has 30% of its inmates are OTMs. OTM means other than Mexicans. And it is a known fact that the American borders are porous. If you are really determined to enter the United States from Mexico, you can do it. And you don't have to be a Mexican to do it. And 30% of these people are not Mexicans. And you have a lot of Islamic people coming across the border from Mexico. And they get in easily into Central America or Mexico. They work their way up to the border and they come across. That's why I'm saying there are a lot of illegals in this country who have come across from Mexico. There are a lot of illegals who come across from Canada. Because Canada, like I said before, is openly encouraging emigration of Muslims into Canada. And then from there, they come into the United States of America. I want to talk now a little bit. We have now about 18 minutes left. I want to talk a little bit about Europe. And to tell you the truth, I've been doing this work for 15 years, since November of 1990. And my personal viewpoint was that war and peace in the Middle East will be decided in Washington, D.C. And that my efforts had to be focused on the American people, on the churches, on the grassroots level. Because if the American people will only have a revival, if the American people will only be Christian, then Israel will be safer. If the American people are not Christian, or if the Christians are put asleep by the one world government that I explained before, has always been clearly with the Islamic world. And today the Muslims are flooding this country with so much immigration, legal and illegal, that the Jews today are already outmaneuvered by the Muslims in America and in Canada. And so my efforts always were to do my work in America, in the churches, to create a grassroots Islamic revolution, excuse me, forgive me, God, a grassroots Christian revival on American soil for the sake of Israel and for the sake of the Christians. What has happened in the last few years is that doors have opened up in Europe, and I have been taking away from my time in America to be in Europe. And by the way, I have to repeat, I'm still 7-8 months a year away from my family in Israel. My wife, my children, and God has blessed me now with grandchildren, they're in Israel. And I'm traveling and traveling and traveling in America, Canada, and now Europe. And I want to share some information. You know, in Israel, very unfortunately, our government, the Israeli government, is not really making an effort to get the truth out to the Europeans. And they're not making an effort to get the truth out to the Americans. American public opinion is not considered important. And we had a leader who I mourn very much, Yitzhak Rabin. I mourn him, and I'm so sad that he was assassinated. But Yitzhak Rabin once said something that it doesn't matter what the Christians think, it's important what the Jews do. So therefore, if it's not important what the Christians think, you know, ignore them. You don't have to invest into PR. And Israeli PR has been infamous for being weak or just simply lacking. And as you may remember, in my very first testimony, I spoke about the International Christian Embassy of Jerusalem. And thanks to Jan Willem van der Hoven, I was invited to speak in Switzerland in 1996, and since then a few times more. And thanks to Malcolm Hedding, I was invited to speak in Finland and Norway. And my wife came with me to Finland and Norway, and we spent 2 weeks there speaking. And the usual response after every meeting from the Christians was, you know, we love the Jews, we love Israel, we love God, we love the Bible, we love Christ, but we never knew any of these things about Israel and about Islam that you're sharing with us. And you know, the European Parliamentary Union voted against Israel 253 to 213 in a famous vote against Israel. But you see, it's not a monolithic vote. It's not a homogeneous vote. It's 253 to 213. You're only talking about 40, 50 votes difference. And if only your Israeli government would send 30 or 40 more people like you and your wife, we could reverse the vote and turn the vote into a pro-Israel vote. In other words, the Jewish people, the Israeli people, are sinning by ignoring the Christians of Europe. And I say also by extension, by ignoring the Christians of Canada and ignoring the Christians of America. And I believe, and I'm fulfilling what I believe by going more and more to Europe, going to countries like Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Belgium, Holland, Finland, Norway, Spain, France. These are countries that have to be visited, and we have to reach out to these political parties and these political groups, not only in the churches, in order to increase support for the state of Israel. In Israel, we have a song, Ha'olam kulo negdenu. The whole world is against us. And there are a lot of Jewish people who enjoy being persecuted, who enjoy being hated, who enjoy being isolated. That does not necessarily have to be. And so my strategy has begun to change. And you know, today, and we're going to talk about this in the 5th seminar, about the roadmap to peace. And there are four parties to the roadmap to peace. You have the United States, the United Nations, Europe, and Russia, the quartet. And each of these four groups are pressuring Israel to make concessions that Israel cannot and will not make. So one of the points I'm saying here is, let's look at the quartet. And let's look at how Islam is growing in strength in each of these groups. Islam is growing in strength in the United States. Israel is growing in strength. Islam is growing in strength in Europe. Islam is growing in strength in Russia and in the United Nations. So what I'm trying to do is to look at the individual trees, not to look at the forest and say the whole forest is against us, but to look at the individual trees to see what can we do to reverse the anti-Israel position of the United Nations, to reverse the anti-Israel position of Europe, to reverse the anti-Israel position of Russia, and of course, most important of all, to reverse the anti-Israel position of the one world government leadership in Washington. And so I've been working very, very closely with a number of countries now and with a number of political parties. And one of the problems in Europe today, indeed, is that after World War II, the European governments became very, very welfare-minded, social-minded, and people in Europe decided to have less children and to give the few children that they had a better life after the suffering of World War II. And what has happened basically is that if a country needs for the women to have 2.1 children per woman for the population to maintain itself, the statistics in Europe are basically 1.5 births per woman, which means that the population of Europe is decreasing. The Jewish population of Europe is decreasing. And in order to maintain the welfare benefits of the retired older people, young people have to be imported into Europe, into France, into Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Italy. All these countries are now importing young people from Africa and Asia, mostly Muslim people. And here too, what has happened in Europe is today the Muslims have reached, for example, in Austria, 20% of the population. The Muslims have 12 children per family. The Jews and the Christians have maybe 1 or 2 children per family, and therefore, within 2 to 3 generations, Austria, a Christian country, will become a Muslim country. France, 17% Muslim, will become a Muslim country within 40 years. And one by one, the countries are falling to Islam. Belgium, Holland, more than 50% of people under 18 in Belgium and Holland today are Muslims. Belgium and Holland will be Muslim countries in a few years. And so I'm working with parties like the Flemish Bloc in Belgium. I'm working, who are Catholics, by the way. And hopefully the doors will open in France with Jean-Marie Le Pen, or with Jörg Haider of Austria, or with Gianfranco Fini of Italy. These are Catholic political parties in Europe that have awakened to the realities of the Islamic peaceful takeover of their countries. My wife and I were in Switzerland in August of 1993, and Muslims came up to us in the meetings. Muslims came to hear me speak. And I said to the Muslims, I looked them in the eye, and I said, you know, I don't hate you guys. I love you guys. You just have a rotten system. And you fled from your rotten system in the Middle East to come to Europe because Europe has a good system. But the problem is, you're going to make the good system a rotten system if you push Islam onto the Christians and the Jews. And the Muslims said to me, the Christian Europeans colonialized us for hundreds of years, and now it's our turn, the Muslims, to colonialize Europe. We are going to conquer Europe. We're going to take it over. And so today Europe is facing a war for the soul of Europe. Will Europe continue to be the heart, the birthplace of Judeo-Christian Western civilization and democracy, or will Europe become an Islamic continent? And I'll tell you one thing, for the survival of Israel and for the survival of the Jews, Europe must remain a Christian continent. And so I'm working with the Christians. I am a Jew who is working with the Christians. And I'm working with Catholic political parties. By the way, this week I received an email from Jody Anderson in Dallas-Fort Worth that the Catholic Church has issued a statement warning Catholic women not to marry Muslim men because Muslim men go by different rules, and this threatens Catholicism in Europe. So even the Catholic Church is beginning to understand the threat of Islam. So Europe now is turning increasingly towards Islam. We have only a few minutes left. I want to talk a little bit about Bill Clinton and about the wars that took place in the 1990s in the former Yugoslavia. And this will prepare us for the fifth and final seminar. Yugoslavia was a country which was comprised of a number of states. You had Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia. And what happened there is a sample of what's about to happen in Europe, in other countries, and in Israel. The Turks, who came into Europe 500 years ago, began to divide and conquer the native peoples of Europe. The Albanians took a few hundred years. The Albanians, the majority of them were converted to Islam. The Bosnians were Bogomil Christians. They were converted to Islam, also a process of hundreds of years. And so today you have peoples in Europe like the Albanians and the Bosnians who were Christians 500 years ago. Today they're Muslims. And they are marching for Allah. They are marching for Islam. You have, for example, from history, 1389 was the Battle of Kosovo Field. 1389, the Turks conquered Serbia. Pristina, which is the capital of Serbia, Pristina, the capital of Kosovo, was the Jerusalem of the Serbian Orthodox Church. You had in Pristina, or you still have, 1,000 churches and monasteries. Many of them have now been burned to the ground by the Muslims. And what I want to do is to talk a little bit about Bill Clinton's role in supporting Islam and sacrificing the Christians. You had a Serbian land, and as a result of the Turkish invasions, land which was Serbian for over 1,000 years, little by little was taken over by the Muslims. By war? No, not by war. By peaceful demographic invasion. The Albanians came into Kosovo through the Turkish rule. The Turks were finally defeated in 1912, but by then the damage was done. Adolf Hitler came in World War II and massacred the Serbs, took away their lands, and gave it to the Muslims. The Muslims, by the way, were the allies of Adolf Hitler in World War II. The Serbs were the allies of the Jews and the Christians, allies of Russia and America. And the Serbs died in the Nazi concentration camps, together with the Jews. And yet Bill Clinton supported the Muslims. He didn't support the Christians. And so little by little, Pristina, Kosovo, Bosnia, these areas were handed over to the Muslims. Hitler increased it. And the leader of Yugoslavia, Tito, was not a Serb, he was a Croat. And so he handed over more lands to the Albanians in the 1950s for political reasons. And so today Kosovo is 90% Muslim, even though it is the birthplace of the Serbian Orthodox Church, the holiest place, the Jerusalem of the Serbian Orthodox Church. And Bill Clinton sacrificed the Serbs for the sake of the Muslims. There's a man by the name of Slobodan Milosevic. Slobodan Milosevic is not a nice guy. He was a dictator. He was a communist. And he was also very, very mean to his own fellow Serbs. When the breakup of the Yugoslav Republic took place, Slobodan Milosevic stopped being what is called a communist, and he became a nationalist. And his job as president of Yugoslavia was to try, to the best of his efforts, to defend his country from being broken up, to defend the territorial integrity of what remained. If you remember, Slovenia broke away, Croatia broke away. By the way, Croatia broke away with Serbian land, and Bill Clinton supported the Croatians. When Krajina, for example, Krajina was a very important Serbian land for 1,000 years, settled by Serbs. The Serbs were expelled by Bill Clinton by ultimatum. Bosnia handed over to this new Bosnian Islamic Republic. Izetbegovic wrote in his doctoral thesis that Bosnia would become the first Islamic republic in Europe. So Bill Clinton used NATO, used American flyers, and NATO troops and US troops to punish the Serbs and to kill thousands of Serbs because of so-called ethnic cleansing. And Bill Clinton said that 100,000 Muslims were wiped out by the Serbs in the first days of the war, when in fact it was a handful, maybe 3,000, 4,000. I'm not saying that it was good that these innocent Muslim civilians were killed, but a lot of these people were not innocent civilians. They were armed Muslim terrorists fighting against the Serbs and committing ethnic cleansing against the Serbs. And so eventually, Serbia was chopped down by Bill Clinton. Slobodan Milosevic was arrested, was kidnapped, and taken to The Hague in the Netherlands. And today, he is on trial for war crimes and stands to spend many, many years, the remainder of his life perhaps, in jail as a war criminal. And some people call him the butcher of the Balkans, worse than Adolf Hitler. And that's not true. And the reason I'm concluding these 2 hours with Slobodan Milosevic is because what the world wants to do, what the one world government wants to do, is to come to Israel, and if they could sacrifice Christian land, then the Christians can come to the Jews and say, hey, we sacrificed Christian land to create the Islamic Republic of Albania, to create the Islamic Republic of Bosnia, to create the Islamic Republic of Kosovo in the heart of Europe. And we're going to take Jerusalem from the Jews, like they took away Pristina from the Serbs, and we're going to give it to the Muslims. And we're going to take Jewish land, and we're going to give it to the Muslims. And Ariel Sharon, or any prime minister who comes after Ariel Sharon, if he does not do exactly as he is told by the one world government, then any Israeli prime minister could theoretically be a candidate for the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague in the Netherlands. And you know, we're talking now in the middle of May of 2004. The Israeli army is very, very active at this moment in Gaza, trying to broaden the security perimeter along the border with Egypt. And unfortunately, it happens in these operations that civilians get killed because they get in the line of fire. And the Palestinian spokespeople come out immediately and say, war crimes, just like Serbia. And what's going to happen to the Israeli leadership is what happened to the Serbian leadership, and what's going to happen to Israel is what happened to the Serbs. And so my answer to all of this is Christian revival for Israel's survival. Israel, Jerusalem, belongs to the Jews and the Christians. And unless the Jews and the Christians march together under one flag to defend Israel and to defend Jerusalem, the one world government which sacrificed the Serbian people, who were the allies and were the good guys, and sacrificed them for the sake of the Muslims. This same scenario, unfortunately, could happen to Israel and to the Israeli leadership. And don't forget, we are talking about 500,000 Jews who live across the former borders with Jordan, Syria, and in Gaza. And so Israel needs the Christians to stand with the Jews. And we will talk about the war, I'm afraid, that is very near and could happen at any moment in the Middle East. A war which could be a missile war and a nuclear war. And of course, Christians, those of you who are watching this teaching, most of you know that the victory is in our hands. You know the back of the book. And God bless you, and God save America, and God save Israel, and God save this world. Thank you. Shalom.